Well, welcome everyone to African Philosophy Conversations. My guest today is Dr. Elvis Imafidon. He is a lecturer at SOAS, which is the School of Oriental and African Studies, which is part of University of London. His PhD is from Ibadan in Nigeria. He has published, he's both authored and edited a number of recent books, including the recent Handbook of African Philosophy of Difference. He has authored a book called African Philosophy and the Otherness of Albinism. That's a Routledge book in 2018. He edited a book called The Ethics of Subjectivity, Perspectives Since the Dawn of Modernity. So he's very prolific and gets into some really interesting issues connected with African philosophy. So welcome, Dr. Imafidon, or Elvis, or however we should call ourselves. Welcome. I'm so glad that you gave me a little time to chat today.
Thank you so much, Bruce. It's really an honor for you to invite me to have this conversation with you. I'm always interested in having conversations around African philosophy, and I'm happy you have me.
Yeah, great. So I guess, the place I like to start usually is just to find out what brought people into the study of philosophy in general and African philosophy in particular. How did you find your way into doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, sort of an accident. I did want to study economics at first in university and then law. Mm-hmm. But in the university system in Nigeria, you could get in with into a particular program. I think this happens everywhere. And then you can switch to a different program if you need to in the second year. So I got into philosophy because that was what was offered me in about 3 different programs. And I chose philosophy at that point, and with the intention of changing in the second year. But I think that first year was a game changer for me. I was no longer seeing philosophy as a discipline or a degree or a program. It sort of provided me with very important tools to interrogate existence, questions that have been bothering me, particularly with the African experience. And I started seeing things, we say scales fell off my eyes, and I said, well, I think this is where I want to be. And so I remained, and it's been a fantastic journey since then. So that's how I got into philosophy. And when I decided to remain, I then realized something that my dad never told me, that he did philosophy. So he then, well, you want to go ahead with philosophy? I have these books. This is from Bertrand Russell's book, History of Philosophy. This is, Daddy, you read philosophy? Yeah, I did history and philosophy in UNILAG, University of Lagos. Well, I never knew. And yeah, I think that just sparkled the interest a bit more. And yeah, I think philosophy basically gave me a better understanding of life. It wasn't just a program for me. It gave me the possibility to interrogate my existence, my lived experiences. And so basically I followed that dream all along. Yeah.
So you mentioned that, the book that your father gave you was Bertrand Russell, very common, famous book in Anglo, British philosophy. So I'm interested in what you would have learned in your degrees in philosophy at Ibadan and before that, and how you found your way to what we might think of as African philosophy, because whatever else Bertrand Russell is, he doesn't seem to be African philosophy, right? So
yeah, exactly. That's a very good question to start talking about African philosophy. I think, as you said, my dad gave me a book on Western philosophy. It is titled The History of Western Philosophy, and that is what it is. And in my 4 years as an undergrad in Nigerian university, in the great city of Benin, Edo State, before I then went for my master's and PhD at the University of Ibadan, In those 4 years, the curriculum was purely British, still retaining a lot of the colonial legacy. So in the first year, you do ancient philosophy, and ancient philosophy is simply ancient Western philosophy. So you do Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, all the ancient Greek guys. And then you do introduction to ethics, where the same Western thing. So in these 4 years, I was grounded on Western philosophy, really, thoroughly, particularly on all sorts of tradition, the analytical, the post-analytical. So basically the curriculum, and this is quite similar to all Nigerian universities, and I worry that it's still same till now. From the first year to the fourth year, you basically go through the history of Western philosophy. From ancient, in year 2, you focus more on medieval. In year 3, you focus more on early modern and late modern. In year 4, you focus more on contemporary Western philosophy. And so I was really grounded in this tradition. Obviously, my dad was at the University of Lagos. But really that got me thinking, because there were obvious semblances here and there in terms of experiences that were discussed in these theories, in these postulations. As an African growing up, there were questions about values, questions about knowledge, even from names. My sister's native name is Aigunyiri, which means no one masters existence. I don't know what is more what we could classify as existential philosophy, if not that nobody masters existence. And then out of a total of about 40 modules, because it's really intense. You do about 16 modules a year. Out of over 40 modules, only one was titled African philosophy in an African space. And it was, for me, basically very restricted to the question about the existence of African philosophy, and then some stuff about African studies, as it were. Quite descriptive, not very critical or interrogative of life experiences. But I realized that the tools philosophy as a discipline, as a training professionally offers me, helps me to interrogate my lived experiences. And so in the final year, I was assigned a supervisor for, we call it long essay, so dissertation, ISP, whatever. And you were to submit 3 topics, and then he would discuss them with you and approve one. And so I submitted 3 topics on African philosophy, then African. And they said, well, I think you did just one course or module in African philosophy. Where are you going to find the literature, the materials, and all of that? Why not do something in the mainstream philosophy, mainstream being Western? I said, well, I think the title of the one I wanted him to approve was more of a response to the claim that African philosophy or African thought were prelogical or purely religious or spiritistic in a sense. And I then submitted a proposal for writing on the scientific and metaphysical contents of African philosophy. And he said, well, he was also, when he saw that I was insisting, he became really supportive. He sent me to a friend in Ibadan, which was about maybe 7 hours road trip, who had a very rich library. And for the first time, I became exposed to Masolo, Kiechi, Wiredu, and I was blown away. I was fascinated, And I made copies of this book because I couldn't buy them from online. I made photocopies of many of them, and then went back home. And he said, my supervisor said, well, you have to read as many before we discuss. So I read and read, first continued reading, and then that part was basically created. And I did the essay on the scientific and rational contents of African traditional thought. And that really, I pursued that into a book, which was basically my first book in 2012, I think, the question of the rationality of African traditional thought. And so that really built my interest. And so when I went for my MA at the University of Ibadan, I followed the path of looking at this comparison between Western and African philosophy.
Right.
And I did that looking at comparing Western and African ontology, particularly, where I did a critique of Heidegger's Being and Time in relation with African ontology. And then in my PhD, did that with ontology and ethics. I did a critique of Habermas' discourse ethics and in relation with African ethics. So there's my general interest has then from then became this comparative African Western philosophy. And so that's basically how I got into the path.
Wow. So it required some, perseverance on your part to, travel that distance and, find that library and do what needed to be done in order to find those texts, because, I think some people might think, well, they're just available everywhere if you're on the continent of Africa. And, what you describe is very much my experience as well. They really aren't everywhere. You have to know where to look. I remember being in Kenya, and that's the place of Odera Aruka and many significant figures, and yet it was very hard to get the texts until I talked my way into the bookstore at the University of Nairobi, into the back room, and they didn't even know what they had there, but I talked my way back there, and they let me look around, and I came out with an armload of books. They were all there. They just So it was there. You have to be have perseverance to find this stuff. Yeah. So I'm interested in your recent work. Your most recent book, Handbook of African Philosophy of Difference, and the one just before that, African Philosophy and the Otherness of Albinism. I think both get at a similar kind of question on what I'm going to call identity and difference. And I guess I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you conceive of those notions of identity and difference, within an African context, and what's included in those. How do we think about those concepts?
Yeah. This is for me my current area of research, identity, difference, and yet, whenever I'm asked about it, I always take this pause and where to start, because I think it's so all-encompassing, as I said. Identity issues are issues of race, disability, difference, colorism. It's very broad. But I think I like to begin by saying that identity questions are can be approached from two basic angles. First, it is ontic. Identity is ontic. It is factual. It is the factuality of our being. And in this sense, I'll basically speaking in ontological terms. Two perspectives seem to dominate ontology and existentialism in terms of, essence precedes existence, and then more recently, existence precedes essence. But I think identity does precede our existence in the sense of its onticity, in terms of its factuality. I don't decide where I'm thrown into. I'm basically born somewhere, I become conscious somewhere, and that the identity I take up from that place is something I don't decide. It's something I'm thrown into. It's something that is part of my being. And that really reminds me of your excellent work on the question of place in philosophy. And I use that I use your book, your essays to introduce African philosophy, to introduce debates in world philosophies, because I think I always like to begin with that question of place. Ontologies are, in a sense, placed. The very space in which you find your being decides your identity at that moment. I think this idea of identity in its ontic factual sense, in terms of being a concrete reality, is not much of the problem. It is what it is. Factualities are things that are just like being. We can't change it. I think the issue begins to start in the second angle from which you could approach identity, which is the identity as constructed, as normative, as political. In this sense, it is me seeing an identity just as it is in reality. And for some reasons, most of the time is for power control, I create an idea about it. I construct a theory about that identity, and I sort of provide a normativity about it, and find ways to sustain it into society, and deeply root it into society and pass it on, and that becomes the huge veil that sort of covers all the actual ontic identities. Human experiences obviously have been shaped by constructed identity, which I think the general term for it is identity politics. And those constructed identities is what mostly shapes our lived experiences. I tell my students in African philosophy that I've never seen a white person or a black person, really, literally speaking. I've never seen a white person. I've not seen a black person, but I've seen people with different shades of melanin. That's the ontic fact. Some are pale looking, some are creamish, some are brownish, but the very construction of two very radical different colors to represent these shades of melanin is a constructed identity, it's not the actual identity. And we know from history what the creation of blackness and whiteness, what the creation of race has led to. Bringing it now to African philosophy more particularly, I think this plays out a lot. I just finished a paper on differential politics in Nigeria polity, and how identity difference and the politics or the construction of these things has been key in understanding violence and crisis and issues in African spaces. And I think the relationship between identity as constructed is that it talks about the self and the other. So I construct an identity about myself, and I sell it to the world. This is who I am. I'm the superautan guy. I am the able-bodied man, and so on and so forth. And then, in order for you to accept the construction of my identity, I then construct the identity of the other as well, to make sure the other remains the subaltern and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I think what lies in between these constructions of the self and the other is difference. And I think difference itself can be understood within these two angles. Some difference is ontic. It is what it is factual. And I think in what I'm trying to explore in a new book, I don't know when I will finish, being a difference, is that one of the less explored area of ontology is difference. And I'm simply saying to be is to be different. Beings exhibit dissimilarities, uniqueness, and they are just ontic, they are factual, they are what it is, they just are there. But in order to support the identity we've constructed, we do not focus as well on those ontic differences. Rather, we construct the differences that we want to sell out to the world. And so there's also a differential politics going on. And this is what I experienced in Africa. And I would just speak to this specific lived experience that led to the book, African Philosophy and the Otherness of Albinism. My motivation for that book was both personal and professional. Professional because I've been trained in philosophy. I have those conceptual tools, those theoretical frameworks to interrogate albinism. Personal because I was born as a person with albinism to a family where I was the only person with albinism. I had my dad, my mom, and 6 other siblings. I was the last actually of the siblings. So, and the lived experiences, the realities of living with albinism, as I put it in one of my papers, being white in a densely Black community, are not funny.
Right.
Within the family space, I was fortunate to have parents who were quite enlightened. And believe me, when I say enlightened, I don't mean educated. I wouldn't like to confuse the two terms, because there are professors of medicine in hospitals in Nigeria who would treat a person with albinism terribly. I mean, he's educated. For some reason, perhaps because my dad read philosophy, I don't know, I'm not sure why, but I know they were very open-minded people. I lived within that small unit of the society, that family, where I felt loved, cherished, and taken care of. And then in the larger society, in schools, if I go to church, if I go to a business, to a marketplace, and the experience I had there, the strong exclusion and discrimination and marginalization that permeates society. It doesn't need to be said with actions and inactions. You sit in a bus, and if there's a person sitting there before, and then a person with albinism sits close to the person gets up, and I can't stay close to someone. So there were these experiences. And after my PhD in philosophy, I started thinking about them in relation to the news at the time. There were a lot of reported killings all over Africa, in Tanzania, in Kenya, and so on. It's a widespread sub-Saharan African issue.
Right.
And I realized that it has emerged from the same difference between ontic identity and difference, and the constructed identity and difference. So approaching it historically, you find explanations that, well, you found these communities in the past, all Black, and then suddenly a woman gave birth to a person with albinism. And sometimes at first they say, well, let's see what happens. And it's an agrarian community, and everybody goes to farm. And then this young lad goes to farm, and the son basically roasts his skin. He can't survive it. In a few years, he has cancer, which is not then known as cancer, and he dies off. His early 20s, and that happens over time. And then there's need for a theory. There's need for his identity to be formulated. And so there were these formulations about what albinism is, what leads to albinism, often in metaphysical terms, caused from ancestors and so on, and the need for these persons to be excluded from the community of beings. Yeah. So that is what I really wanted to look at, and that's what the book really discusses in detail. Yeah.
Well, I have about 100 questions based on what you have just been talking about. It's really, really fascinating. I mean, I guess the first comment that I'd make is that when you were starting off to talk about these two different forms of questions around identity, what struck me was that narrative was very much embedded in the attempt to, as you say, construct some notion of identity. But it's not just a narrative that the individual makes all on their own. It's a socially shared narrative. It's a narrative that we all agree to accept in some sense. And that really, in some way, I think leads us into what you were just now saying about albinism, because there is a kind of narrative extant, not just in Nigeria, as you say, but across Africa. And I'm interested in getting into what the fears are, what that story is that is so widely shared, and why does it have currency? Like, why does it continue to live on in an age when it should be very clear that this is a mere fact of birth, and it's not a moral condition or a religious condition or anything else like that. So why, what stories are people telling, and just kind of uncritically accepting amongst themselves?
Yeah, I think ideologies and false consciousness, these constructed theories about who we are, about identity, about differences, they are so deeply rooted. And I mean, it's difficult to uproot a tree that has a very deep root. And I think that's the same kind of feeling with these sort of beliefs that saturate society. And what is interesting about them is how they interconnect with other beliefs, how they, the same way Ubuntu in African philosophy will mean that people are codependent. Right. You find theories and really being codependent, texts being codependent. And I think that's the point I pushed in the conference recently about Ubuntu as a relational hermeneutic ethic. How basically in every sphere of life we don't understand one thing without linking it with right. similar things. Right. And so you find, for instance, ideas about albinism being sustained even in contemporary times with ideas about witchcraft, with ideas about the Christian God, with ideas about other religions. It's so interlinked that it becomes so difficult to approach. And I've been doing a 2-year project on alternative explanations on disability with a colleague in Lancaster University. We had this grant to look at alternative explanations on disability in Africa. And in November, I was in Nigeria doing some interviews with NGOs, and you realize it's shocking how deeply rooted these things are even today, not just with albinism, with other forms of disability, and the struggle that these NGOs go through in trying to convince a parent that this is the case. There are biological explanations as well as, and even I think part of the project is also a critique of the medical biological explanation, which obviously is the basis for another whole set of issues with able-bodiedness in quote and ability. And I've written a fantastic book on albinism. Yeah. But where it is in the library. It's it's something fanciful for scholars to read. Right. And there are so many fantastic essays online as well, in journals. But my uncle in the village doesn't even if he has an access to, he's not interested in reading a paper in philosophy. Yeah. So I think the issue is that they sustain because they've been sustained in society because we've not approached it rightly. Yeah. I think it's not an issue that only scholars can deal with. Right. It's an issue that you have to be connected with other stakeholders. Right. To really make a difference, a grassroots difference. Otherwise, we'll keep talking about these things, we'll keep writing about them, and they just end up where they end up. And those who are really affected by it don't see them. Right.
I mean, mean, I find this especially fascinating, and you are the one that's done the most sustained and extensive study on this. But I'm interested, like from an American point of view, when people think about identity categories, I think they have a very kind of well-defined set of those. Race is one of them, gender is one of them, ability and disability is one. And I heard you putting albinism under that general umbrella of ability and disability, which is an interesting one in a certain sense, because if it's a disability, it's a social one, right? In other words, there's nothing intrinsic that makes your life more difficult, except for the stories that people tell amongst themselves about albinism, right? In other words, there's this social phenomenon that makes your life more difficult. I mean, qualitatively so, but
I mean, there is, of course, the anatomical side of things,
right.
which I think only recently, when the UN had a mandate on albinism, that the recognition of albinism as a disability started emerging, which is why if I'm filling a form, I won't see on the list albinism as a disability. Yeah. I mean, I'm in the UK now, and I will likely not be able to drive in the UK because my vision can't meet the standard. It's a combination of some anatomical disability. I can't stay under the sun or outdoors for too long without risking skin cancer and so on and so forth.
Right.
But I think these are issues that I can live with. These are issues that anyone with albinism can, cope with, because I think everyone has this form of, disability to cope with all through life. But the more complicated issues is when you know who you are, and someone tells you, well, no, that's not you. You are this, you're a cause. And in my book, there was a point I was trying to make about, it's not just the identity issue is not just an issue for the one who creates them. So someone constructs an identity and a narrative about albinism, as this is what identifies a person with albinism, and uses that to judge a person with albinism. But it's even more problematic because a person with albinism growing up within that community assimilates those narratives and basically live with them. It takes a struggle not to say, well, I think I can't do anything. I think I just have to, because the community keeps telling you that this is who you are, and you end up identifying with that narrative. I think one very interesting thing about identity issues with albinism is how it fits into the race discourse. And I've raised it severally in classroom and in other conversations. When I walk, for example, when I'm walking through an airport, dressed in like an Englishman, and I'm walking past you, I'm not visibly Black.
Right. And
so I've been in a situation where someone is telling a Black guy, from your accent, I know you're Nigerian. Elvis, where are you from? I say, I'm from Nigeria. I say, you see the awe. What do you mean you're from Nigeria? I was visiting my brother in Berlin in a few years back, and he was introducing me to a friend and said, this is my brother. The friend kept laughing. How is it your brother? He's my blood brother. He's my younger brother. I don't believe you. That raises this very, for me, it shows the place albinism could bring to the discourse of race.
Right.
That our focus in race, which race for me is a constructed narrative, which, as you said, somehow we just take it for granted and we accept it.
Right.
Albinism brings to that discourse that race, the discourse of race, critical race theory, racism, is brings to our attention that it focuses a lot on visibility, on what is seen, and that identity may not be solely about what is seen.
Absolutely.
But it's sort of reductionist to tie race discourse to visibility.
Right.
And there's a lot of issues that has brought, and I'm hoping that in the future I can do a bit more research on this and see how albinism intersects with critical race theory and racism.
Well, and I hope you do that, because I think that's a really fascinating connection there. You mentioned being in the UK, in London now, and have you, in terms of identity and difference, have you found that works out differently when you're in the UK than when you're in Nigeria, or your brother is in Germany, differently there again?
I speak again of your research on place. It matters in this discourse, and we should never think that issues of race and racism is felt the same way universally. It's not. In Nigeria, questions about race hardly and rarely comes up. Hardly. It's not until when I started, going outside of Nigeria for research, the 6 months fellowship I did in Johannesburg, and then now in the UK, that the issue really stared at me, and I started really seeing how they incorporate into my general research scheme. But in Nigeria, the question of race hardly comes up. And sometimes when I have conversation with colleagues in Nigeria and talk about these things, it's not a front burner issue.
Right.
Because within that space, you are home, as it were. You're with your fellow brothers and sisters in the community, and but the issue of race always and continues to raise its ugly head once we are within that space where there is that visible diversity. When you are not in your home, as it were. And so definitely being in the UK really brings that issue up the ladder of priority. Not just in terms of research, but in terms of lived experience.
Right.
And again, this is the intersection of albinism. I don't feel it a lot, except I'm within a space where I'm known, where the details are glaring and obvious where this guy comes from.
Right.
But my wife would feel it more. My brother in Germany has felt it more. We've had this laugh about them and conversations about them.
Right.
But I think too that identity politics and differential politics, as I like to call it, as it relates to racism and critical race theory, are very the discourse, the conversations around them are very political. It's a circle of differential politics. Each side has certain who I am in terms of identity and how I'm different from you in terms of often with the goal of seizing power and control radically and violently. And yes, sometimes that is necessary, but I think a very good complement to that political discourse would be an ethical discourse. I think that is often missing because, as I said, when you are home being, which obviously would mean so many things, you don't feel it.
Right.
It's a question of hospitality in the first place, and how we've conceptualized hospitality is a question of hermeneutic ethics in terms of interpretation. And you had a very good essay which I used in class in the companion to hermeneutics, I think, the Radford companion to hermeneutics. We need to think of ways of understanding the other that imposes on us certain duties and responsibilities of care, of empathy, of hospitality, of
and self-critical or self-questioning as well. You know, I mean, that's maybe the strength of hermeneutics, to turn the question back on us. Who am I?
Yeah, exactly.
The world this way. Yeah,
exactly. We need to be. Yeah, I think the discussion needs to be balanced. Right. It cannot be. I mean, no discussion is apolitical. Right. It will have its political tension and coloring. It needs to have a lot of ethical coloring as well.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with that. So you've given me a lot of time here, and I really appreciate that. I guess I have one last question, and that is, you know, when you are trying to interest students in African philosophy, what do you tell them about? What do you point them to? Are there authors or books or papers that you find useful to get students to kind of, you know, like you said yourself, you'd learned a bunch of Western philosophy, and then, you know, there was a moment at which, you know, you started thinking that African philosophy was, you know, had something for you. So how do you convince students?
Yeah, currently I teach the African philosophy UG and African philosophy PG modules here at SOAS, and I must say it's been a huge success. The PG, I had about 32 PG students at the end of last year doing it, and they were a fantastic bunch. They always are. And I see that there's a lot of interest in philosophy and place. And by the way, many of my PG students wants to meet you. Perhaps I can organize a lecture online.
Always happy to chat.
And so what I do is to begin by resolving this tension of place at the beginning of the lectures, and the question of philosophy as a human experience and as well as an experience from a place. I try to, it's difficult because I think I don't have an infallible position on it. It's a position that needs revision.
Who does? I mean, really, yeah. You know.
So basically, I talk about philosophy being that side of our humanity that makes us ask questions, critical questions, that make us to want to construct and formulate theories about what we experience about our being, about our, and that is shared. That is shared across board anywhere humans are found.
Right.
But the product of that reflection would vary from place to place, and what we do or what we intend to do in African philosophy is how has it varied within African philosophy? What are those theories that have emerged from that space? Right. And then we basically do, first half of term, we do a lot of theories, epistemology, ethics, ontology, metaphysics, all sorts of theories. And second half, we do all sorts of application to the environment, to disability, to racism, and it's, the hours are never enough for discussion because I like to be like a student in the class, looking for trouble, throwing questions here and there, and just having that conversation. And thanks to the older guys like you, we have a lot of resources, I think African philosophy, it's fascinating what it has produced in terms of written resource. In the last 7 decades, it's just fascinating. The books you have, Wiredu's Companion to African Philosophy, your book, Philosophy as if Place Mattered, and a whole bunch of African philosophers. But one key point is that you find philosophy in odd places, not only in books, as we've been told. We find philosophy in African names, proverbs, adages, customs, and I really do push them to look for those ones as well, and not to stick to the binary between written and spoken.
Well, it sounds to me like you're in a bit of a fortunate situation in that the students you get are already motivated and already interested.
They are very interested.
That's really a wonderful place to be. So, Well, thank you so much for joining me today. This was a really great conversation. This is Dr. Elvis Imafidon, who is at SOAS University, School of Oriental and African Studies at University of London, originally from Nigeria, and has written some really fine works on questions around identity and difference. So thank you again, and I hope to chat with you again soon.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for inviting me. I enjoyed the conversation myself.
Most welcome.